Namaste and greetings. I'm Mahima Kapoor, researcher and assistant editor at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi. Welcome you all to the IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a special lecture on feminist vision of building a better world in the post-pandemic period. This deliberation is being organized by the IMPRI Gender Impact Study Center. I feel privileged to introduce the speaker, Professor Roxana Marinescu. Ma'am is the professor, Faculty of International Business and Economics, Department of Modern Languages and Business Communication, Bucharest University of Economic Studies, Romania. Welcome, ma'am. I feel honored to introduce the chair, Professor Vibhuti Patel, visiting professor IMPRI, New Delhi, and former professor, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and Ambassador Daniela Mariana Sezonov-Ţane, Ambassador, Embassy of Romania in New Delhi, India, who will be giving her special remarks. Welcome. We are fortunate to have Professor Manisha Desai, Dr. Chitra Sinha, and Professor Lakshmi Lingam as the discussants. Professor Manisha Desai is the department head, Sociology, and Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies, University of Connecticut, USA. Welcome, ma'am. Dr. Chitra Sinha is an independent academic, author, and gender studies specialist, and co-founder, Coheji Training and Education Management. Welcome, ma'am. Professor Lakshmi Lingam is the Dean, School of Media and Cultural Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Welcome, ma'am. Now I invite Professor Vibhuti Patel to take the proceedings further, and we look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Vibhuti, ma'am, please unmute.
Yeah, good evening, friends. First of all, I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to Professor Arjun Kumar, Professor Dr. Simi Mehta, and Dr. Mahima Kapoor for making the arrangement and giving us this platform to discuss a very important topic of feminist vision of building better world in the post-pandemic period. I greet my esteemed professors and experts, Professor Roxana Marinescu, who is going to make presentation, Professor Lakshmi Lingam, Professor Manisha Desai, and Dr. Chitra Sinha, and also esteemed participants who are going to enrich our discussion today. The lockdown and social isolation imposed due to coronavirus infection also forced women to bear the burden of unpaid care work, both in terms of housework, homeschooling of children, enhanced care burden of sick children and elderly. Over the last 18 months, women's rights groups, community-based non-government organizations, networks on right to food, right to shelter, citizens associations, self-help groups, trade unions have been busy providing provisions for all necessary services like food and shelter and water and healthcare all over the globe. We are getting reports from our feminist sisters in Latin America, in other Asian countries, and in South Asia, and in African countries for the marginalized and socially excluded poor people in the nation states, but it is not enough. In July 2021, the civil society organizations from several countries all over the world, they joined hands and recently formed Gender Equality Forum, which demands the fiscal expansion of macroeconomic policies for transformative finances aimed at gender equity and gender equality, proactive implementation of gender responsive budgets, and transparent and inclusive accountability processes in response to massive loss of livelihood and human lives triggered by health emergency as a result of coronavirus pandemic. In a statement by Asia Pacific sign-on letter, Accountability for Gender Equality Forum, Commitments and Civil Society Engagement by 20 intersectional feminist civil society organizations in the region of Asia and Pacific. The efforts of GEF have been appreciated as establishment of Gender Equality Forum in July 2021 would bring gender audit and gender equality concerns center stage. GEF has promised to raise 40 billion USD for government budgets, corporate houses, global foundations towards the human development goals and towards achieving targets and commitments of Gender Equality Forum Action Coalition. GEF unanimously decided to strive for collective action and global as well as local intergenerational dialogues for increased public and private investment in the areas of economic justice, human rights of workers, reproductive health needs of rights of girls and women, environmental safety and climate justice, addressing gender-based digital divide, promoting simple harvesting of technology and innovation for gender equality, ensuring gender inclusiveness in the leadership of economic and political decision-making processes. Gender Equality Action Coalition also accepted GEF will strictly adhere to human rights principles and adopt data-driven and evidence-based consultative processes that involves women's rights groups, community-based activists working for social solidarity during the pandemic, government organizations, non-government organizations, and employers association. Now, it is in this context, IMPRI decided to hold this kind of a special lecture, which would focus on the feminist vision of building better world. We know that wherever there was a women's leadership in 18 countries, they put people before profit, and there was so much of concern for the human misery. So it is very important at this stage to come up with a proper understanding on feminist vision of building better world in the post-pandemic period. And I would first request Professor Roxana Marinescu for giving her perspective. Over to Professor Roxana Marinescu.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with you. Oh, sorry. Can I do that?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Can we go to Ambassador Daniela for her quick intro remarks?
She's waiting. She's waiting for Roxana's lecture, right, and then she will give her remarks. Yeah.
Okay, please go ahead. We can see it. Yes, ma'am. Please go
ahead. Yes.
Yes.
All right. Okay, let me start by thanking the organizers for having invited me to share my feminist vision of a future post-pandemic world with you, especially Director Kumar and of course all his colleagues, and Professor Patel, my friend, who is our chair today. It is an honor and a privilege to share this virtual panel with Her Excellency, the Romanian Ambassador to India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, Ms. Daniela Sezonov-Ţane, and also with my colleagues, Professors Desai, Lingam, and Dr. Sina. Let me begin by invoking this article, which you probably know because it was very much circulated at the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020, written by Arundhati Roy, in which she talks about how terrible it would be to go back to what we call the normality of the pre-pandemic period, which for her is a world full of prejudice and hatred and avarice and misused information, and a world with conservative ideas and also environmental issues. What she is urging us to do is to change this normality for a post-pandemic period. And she's using a very interesting metaphor, which you can see, the one of the portal, which the pandemic actually gave to us. So there is an opportunity found in this pandemic, as well as, of course, the bad things that it brought along with it. And I quite agree with her, and like her, I believe that on the one hand, COVID-19 has been a revealer for all the gender inequalities in the world that we knew from before the pandemic as well. But also it offers us this kind of basis for change and an opportunity to move away from this normality that Arundhati Roy spoke about. And I think quite obviously that this future is a feminist one. And this is what I'm here to share with you. So in order to think about the future, I think we need to examine a little bit what the pandemic has brought to us. And it has brought more inequalities and more inequities in terms of gender than we had before. And if you look at this global gender gap report, which was released by the World Economic Forum in March, this year, we can see that they calculated the average distance completed so far to parity, which they say is at 68%. And also they calculated how long it would take for us to get to full parity, gender parity, and that's another 135.6 years. And of course, you can see the components of this average distance, which is global and average, as I said. So the political empowerment, economic participation and opportunity, and educational attainment and health and survival. And you can see how long it would take us to close this gap. Unfortunately, I would have to say that both our countries, as we well know, India and Romania, are below this global average. Nevertheless, we're working towards this. Some more data suggesting the same kind of inequalities. The International Labour Organization showed that 5% of all employed women lost their jobs during the pandemic. Also, the situation with the double shift, which is longer for women due to the pandemic. And we've discussed that as feminists, I think, in a number of other events, such as this one, also organized by IMPRI and other organizations, which this longer double shift also led to an increase in stress and anxiety, especially for women with children, but not only, and an unbalance in their work life balance. So that again, looking at gender gaps on the labor market, we can see how the greatest problems were in the domains requiring technical skills, and you see them on your screens. So all in all, the idea that the pandemic is likely to contribute to greater problems in the future for women. Also worth mentioning that before COVID-19, women carried out 76.2% of the total amount of unpaid care work, which of course we know that is a problem, and that's 3.2 times more than men. And calculations have been done and assessments for the pandemic period, which says that women are spending on average 30 additional hours per week more on childcare alone, and that's childcare only, let alone other members of the family. Now, if we look at other documents, such as this UN Women report from 2020, we can see the situation in other domains, in the informal economy, as I mentioned earlier, but also the most feminized sectors of the economy, which were the most affected. And that's health, education, but also accommodation, the food services sector, and the domestic workers. And you have the data here, so I'm not going to linger more on them. And the report actually talks about the big revealer that the pandemic is. And of course, as feminists, we knew that beforehand, and we have tried to draw attention to the precarity of women's jobs and livelihoods. situation in the economy and so on, but the global power breakers did not take feminist voices too much into consideration. This UN Women report also mentions the environmental and climate crisis, and I think this is an important transnational global issue, which together with the pandemic shows how women were mostly affected, and also the situation with the democracies throughout the world. And again, women are the most affected ones. Another, Vibhuti mentioned earlier, the Global Acceleration Plan of the UN Women, and they also provide data concerning gender-based violence, also child marriages, and the reproductive rights, sexual and reproductive rights of women, problems with these. Again, they mentioned the unpaid care work that women do compared to men, which have increased threefold. And again, the conclusion, which was emphasized by the World Economic Forum, the fact that we still need 135.6 years to achieve pay and leadership equity with men. So of course the question is, do we want to wait that long? And I suppose the answer is, of course we don't. Therefore, we need to try to figure out a way of how we are going to tackle the situation in the future in a post-pandemic world. How can feminists contribute is the question, of course, and we all know how a lot of people around us talk about the death of feminism, which of course we know is not the case, but there are voices who mention that, or the fact that we live in a post-feminist society, feminists being replaced by girl power, which is also under attack by the patriarchy. They are offered this kind of heteronormative and hypersexualized male gaze, but also the backlash which we see, and you know, there are books and volumes written about them, how you know, these detractors of feminism talk about how feminism in fact cannot happen, is not achievable, or on the contrary, it has been achieved, so there's nothing else that can be done, and so on. Also in 2011, Sylvia Walby talked about the new challenges for feminism, and she identified 3 of these challenges: mainstreaming, and the fact that we are with feminism at this intersection with allies and competing forces, so we need to prove ourselves in vis-a-vis them. And these are important, but I think the most important one is the 3rd one, the intensification of the neoliberal context that she talks about. Since 2011, we have seen this intensification even further, and its effects. And among them, I just wanted to mention at this stage populism and nationalism. And to them, I believe feminism is a very coherent and clear response. So my question is, yes, feminism can definitely contribute to this vision, and let's see how. And to me, and this is the vision that I want to share with you now, the center of this this future, which is feminist, should be revolving around the idea of care, but a different type of care as we have now. So it's the feminist ethic of care that I'm suggesting that we should embrace. An opportunity to move away from the privatization of care which we're facing now. And at the beginning, I would like to show the ideas presented in this CARE manifesto. You probably know about it. It was released last year in 2020 by the CARE Collective and published by Verso. And they give a definition of care, which includes all the conditions that we can and the steps that we can take in order to make all the people, but also all the living creatures of the planet to thrive together with the planet. So it's a view which encompasses all living forms. The CARE manifesto actually starts from or puts in the center of their vision, which I am also embracing, a change from the neoliberal paradigm to a feminist paradigm. And we all know that neoliberalism is based on individualism and on profit making and on flows of capital, on competition, and in terms of care, on self-care, or on the marketization of care services. And my feminist vision is a change, departure from that vision in which instead of the individuals, we put communities in the center. Instead of competition, we put cooperation, which is clearly global and transnational, not just within the borders of the nation state. And adopting alternatives to capitalist markets and resisting what I call the marketization of care and care infrastructures, restoring the welfare states which have been dismantled, and also cultivating transnational understanding and cooperation. We know that care and care work have been under attack and have been devalued for decades because this is a feminized profession. So their status and their pay have been going down due to that. So the manifesto also talks about how the emphasis on the individual and on these individualistic ideals gave rise to growing uncaring communities, and these ungrowing communities base themselves on principles of exclusion. So they find their shared identity on exclusion rather than inclusion. Therefore, leading to, as I said, misogyny, white supremacy, populist movements, nationalist movements. Joan Tronto, in her work ever since the 1990s onwards until the recently, also talks about care and the need for a care revolution, as she calls it. Why should we do that? In order to maintain, continue, and repair our world. And by our world, she means our bodies, ourselves, our environment, because she understands that there is a complexity of a network of relationships among all of those. And she talks about how care has been also, in the same way as the CARE manifesto did, care has been professionalized through services such as schools, hospitals, hospices, nursing homes, care facilities, facilities for disabled people, funeral homes, etc., etc. They were placed on the market and unregulated, left to the market forces to regulate themselves. So people access them whenever they need them, but on an individual basis. And due to that, or connected to that, is the idea that care is a so-called naturally feminine characteristic. Therefore, you pay it very little because it matters to women, or you do not pay it at all. So it's all that unpaid care work that we do in the homes, women do in the homes throughout the world. And of course, we know that this is not true and that care can be learned like all the other skills. Because care is left to the market forces, care becomes a private matter. But again, we know that this is not the case, that there are situations when, due to incapacity or age, etc., care cannot be necessarily accessed, and there are forms of care that are very expensive. So again, not everybody can access it. So John Tronto's warning is that, of course, we can keep living in this globalized market in care labor, but then we will continue to replicate the injustices and inequities and unfairness of the world in which we live today. So her idea, and I'm once again embracing this idea, is that we need to change that to a feminist democratic ethic of care, in which we should acknowledge the relationship between individuals, the fact that we don't live alone in this world. We live in communities, and that those communities affect and intersect with other communities. So of course there is a global network of communities in which we live, and that people are vulnerable and in need of care in different periods of their lives. So for example, when they're very young or very old or ill. Therefore, they're simultaneously, or in different periods of their lives, givers and receivers, recipients of care. Therefore, care is in the center of our lives, in fact, in opposition to the neoliberal society in which we also had an ethical system, but with personal responsibility in its center. What John Tronto talks about is different types of care, and also different types of ethical qualities needed to offer this care. You have on the screen now the first four, and this is the last one that she came up in her later work, which is more about plurality of voices and communication, and also the keyword solidarity. And she makes the connection with nowadays democracies. So her conclusion is that humans are not only or mainly creatures of the market, but they are also creatures of care, and that democratic societies need to reorient their values away from support for the market to support for the means for people to live human lives. So they need to balance the need for autonomy and also the need for dependency at the same time. I just want to show, just because so far I've been talking in academic terms, and I appealed to academic texts to support my views, just to show a little bit that there are activists who support the same views. You have here Lima Bowie, who's a peace activist from Liberia, and she also mentions how now this text is very recent from the from the pandemic period, how we need to rethink the world, not in terms of state sovereignty, so not in terms of the national states, but with humanity as the basis of our discussion, and also rethink leadership. And again, she emphasizes the need for solidarity. So all of those feminist ideas. Moreover, she shares these feminist principles, again based on ceasefire and disarmament, demilitarization, and also tackling gender-based violence and issues that have to do with health and the economy, and also global issues such as the environment from a feminist perspective. In the UN Women Feminist Plan for Sustainability and Social Justice, we have the same idea, so the same feminist vision for the future based on social justice and taking the environment and the planet in general into consideration. Again, the keyword solidarity. So what is the solution? Quite clearly, what I have been talking so far, change of paradigm with care in its center, and leading to a change in power balance. And in order to achieve that, what we need to do is include discourses of the so far historically excluded groups. And I would like to quote Rosi Braidotti here, who in her post-human predicament appeals to humans, who she calls, I'm quoting, indigenous knowledge systems, feminists, queers, otherwise enabled, but also to non-human life forms or just non-human forms, such as, again, I quote, non-humans, technologically mediated existences, the virtual people, earth, others, land, water, plant, animals, and non-human inorganic agents such as plastic, wires, information highways, algorithms, etc. According to Rosi Braidotti, a post-human ethical praxis involves the formation of new alliances in which all these voices should be included. And why should we include all these voices? Again, to quote her, because of their capacity to carry out alternative modes of knowing and becoming, and their ability to set up transversal relations, to break up segregation patterns and establish border crossings that aim to actualize their knowledge and visions. So if we put care in the center of this feminist vision, we definitely need to rethink care, not from a traditional perspective as we have it now, a commodity, a personal choice, or a family obligation, but care as a public good, which I think is very important. And that then the recovery, the post-pandemic recovery, will be a care-led recovery. Again, just to appeal to different kinds of voices, I want to appeal to an activist voice once again, Argentinian this time. Once again, the emphasis being on how we need change from the systems that we have nowadays, which is full of gender inequalities, with care in the center, but a transformative type of care. And by taking into consideration the interdependencies and that we have among us, among the caregivers and care receivers as well. And Professor Patel mentioned the Generation Equality Forum at the beginning. So of course, I needed to mention this as well, because it's a very important program and a very important happening in our lives. They mentioned the themes. I mean, they include the 6 themes of the action coalitions, and you have them on your screen, so I'm not going to dwell too much on them. But rather, I would like to show to you how governments can actually use these kinds of visions, or this kind of vision in their recovery plans. And I'm sharing here with you the one for Hawaii, which also has a very nice title, as you can see there. I'm not going to discuss it at length, but just to tell you that it exists. You can find it online, and you can read it if you want to. But just to say that they also think of the recovery plan in terms of this transition from the values that we have now to care being essential, to being again the center of their recovery program. And they also mention how this needs to take into consideration the knowledge developed by what they call marginalized communities. And they list those marginalized communities: women, girls, femme-identified and non-binary people. You can see them on the screen actually: racialized women or women of color, native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and immigrant women to Hawaii. So this transnational kind of category as well. The last slide, I just in the last slide, I just tried to put together all the texts that I referred to in this. I thought that maybe some of you would like to go to them and read them at length, or maybe you know them. But anyway, I thought that maybe I can put them here in a random order, so they're not in any order, but you can see them. So thank you for listening, and we're going to listen now to the other participants, and then I think have a question and answers or discussion time at the end. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Roxana Marinescu, for a detailed and comprehensive presentation about the predicament of women of the world due to current health emergency. Influence of hypersexual male gaze, you mentioned intensification of neoliberal context, global inequality report, you summarized it, sharing the highlights of the transnational feminist discourses, and also UN Global Acceleration Plan, and ended with the need for solidarity. Your brilliant talk made a convincing case for an urgent need for a change of paradigm in the development discourse and building bridges, not walking on the backs. I think currently the commemoration of bridge called My Back has been going on world over in the feminist circles. Now I request Her Excellency Madam Ambassador Daniela Mariana Sezonov to respond to Professor Roxana's lecture, as well as her own perspective. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, namaste, good evening to everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear it, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Roxana Marinescu, for inviting me. Thank you very much, professors, for inviting Roxana to give this very interesting and comprehensive lecture on an issue which is of high concerns for us. I prepared something, but I was thinking during Roxana's presentation, I changed my mind. I want to tell you some of my own experience regarding women inequality and women situation in many poor countries. Why? Because I have a quite extensive experience. I was not all my life a diplomat. I worked as a humanitarian employee. I was a delegate for the International Committee of the Red Cross from 2005 to 2012 and from 2014 to mid-2015. And those, I worked only in field missions, and those missions took me in very difficult conflict or post-conflict environment in which I've seen women in very, very dire conditions. And we may make policies, we may have targets, but the reality on the ground, even before the pandemic, was very, very bad. So I don't want to generalize, because there is no way to generalize. I started my humanitarian life in Ethiopia in 2005 in Tigray, where we have another conflict. It's a repetition of the conflict from the 80s with catastrophic consequences towards for the civilian population. So, and then I worked in Tanzania, I worked in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Nepal, a neighboring country of India, to which I'm also ambassador, in Guinea-Conakry, Sierra Leone, and my last mission was in Chad. So what I can share with you from all these missions is that everywhere in very poor communities, women are bearing the brunt of child rising, building houses, carrying wood for fire, making and carrying water. Women and children in all those contexts where the water is a very precious and far away good, essential good, are in charge with carrying water. And besides this, women are in all these communities are subject to negligence, to violence in the house, in the homes by their husbands, by other male members of the family. And yeah, it's not a nice or beautiful image. I mean, all those things I have witnessed were absolutely horrible. And then when you have a conflict added to this, women are raped, are tortured. And I will tell you a very sad story from Congo. When I was in Congo in 2008, 2009. This is an endless conflict. I mean, it's there since the mid of 90s, and it's a protracted conflict. You almost don't hear anymore on TV about it, only on the occasion of some horrible killings, mass killings, or a new armed group which comes up out of the bush. So the International Red Cross had opened a new domain of activity, meaning working with women who have been subject to violence because of the war. And so the delegate, which was a psycholog, she made a presentation about a poor Congolese woman to whom she had talked, who had been raped 3 times in her life. Her 3 children, girls, have been raped. The elder one twice, and the elder one meaning 9 years old, and the youngest one 4 years old. And this woman, who have been subject to so much, the only thing she was complaining about was not being raped, her and her children, was that she was stolen the only thing she had to provide for her children. She had a big pot in which she was cooking food and selling this food for little money. So, I mean, this is an example of the abject poverty and misery of women in those contexts. Nobody knows about it. Nobody hears about them. We make policies all the time, but the situation in the ground is forgotten. The crises are continuing and continuing, and at the end of the day, these people are hopeless. They spend their lives they lose any hope. There is no light in their lives. And I will tell you another example I don't want to take too much time, but I will tell you another example from Nepal. In Nepal, I was dealing with missing families, so family of people who have disappeared during the conflict. Actually, they were dead, but the bodies have not been recovered. So the International Red Cross was visiting the families, trying to find out if they have needs, and to try to find out if they have gotten in time any more information about the missing persons. In the same time, we were doing intervention with the authorities to try to find out about the fate of the missing. So I visited the family of a girl who have been kidnapped during the conflict. She had been rescued by the UN and given in the care of the Red Cross. We were paying an orphanage to take care of her. She was studying, she was fed, she was in a very good condition given the situation. So I visited her. She was about 15, and I asked her what she wants. And she said, look, I want to go back to my family. I want to see my parents. So I went to see her parents. which were very far away from Kathmandu. I went with my field officer, Nepali field officer. We took the plane and we did 3 days on a mountain. So it was a 6-day trip trekking in the mountains. We had to cross several mountains to reach the village and to find her family. We found her family after 3 days of hard walk. It was a real hard walk. And then I discovered a family which was the poorest of the poor. From their entire village, they were really, really poor. They had more children in the meantime. The father was sick. He was a Sherpa, carrying on his back heavy stuff from the nearest town which was 3 days walk, to their village. And because of being sick, he could not work anymore. And the only working in that family was the mother. When I've seen her, I felt like crying, like she was a poor woman, something like probably 40 years something, but looking at 60 or 65, barefoot, very, very slim. She was working on some neighbors' fields to try to feed her husband, plus another 4, 5, 6 children. I don't remember how many they were in the family. So I came to show a photograph of their daughter and to ask them if they would be happy to have her back. Of course, they were happy to have her back. My worry was that if we bring her back, she will have to be married fast in order to help her family survive. So anyway, to cut the story short, at the end of the day, I advocated to my boss in Kathmandu on another solution, bringing the girl only after the father is cured. So we took her with the help of the volunteers of the Nepalese Red Cross to the nearest hospital in the nearest town. And fortunately, the guy was cured. He could walk back home and provide for his family. And after my departure from Nepal, she was reunited with her family. Anyway, I don't know. Going back to our subject and to the situation of women, today, in the morning, I just read a report. It came to me today and I found it like a sign. Tonight, we discuss about the post-pandemic world and a feminist vision in the post-pandemic world. And I got across a report which is not very good for India. I will just quote you some, it's not very diplomatic of me to criticize India, but I'm not criticizing, I'm just quoting a report which done by the organization World Inequality Report. So according to this report, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated inequalities between the very healthy and the very wealthy, and the rest of the population. Gender inequality remains very high, according to the statistics. The female labor income share in India is 18%, comparing to 21% average in Asia. India dropped 28 places in the global gender gap index in 2021, and now ranks 140 out of 156 countries. It's not very good. Women estimated income is only 1/5 of men, which puts India amongst the bottom 10 countries globally on this indicator, according to World Economic Forum report. The COVID pandemic showed us the need for a unified, coherent, and robust global response, which clearly must transgress national or continental borders. We have now the opportunity to change the status quo. But, of course, for this, we need political will and action. As Roxana mentioned, Romania also is not, Romania doesn't occupy a very honorable place among European countries, EU countries, in this regard neither. So we have a national strategy for gender equality and for preventing and combating domestic violence, which is a huge problem in Romania, as is in India, for 2021 and 2027. While progress has been very slow, we occupy a very non-enviable 25th place in the EU for gender equality out of 27 countries. The strategies put the accent on priorities: education, health, the labor market, work-life balance, leadership, etc. Anyway, it's my strong belief that by sharing experiences and building a solid solidarity network around the globe, we can contribute to a better post-pandemic world. What will be the way forward? I will come to what Roxana mentioned about the environmental crisis. I have studied, I have a master in sustainable development and climate change. I started studying this very late because I felt the need to do it. I saw what's going on around us, and I said I thought that I need to be better equipped to understand better what's happening. So I think in the current environmental crisis, what we need the most is to come back to the feminine values, traditional values, old values, meaning treating the world as our ancestors have done it in the past, with respect. Mother Nature was the great goddess. We forgot about it. Now we are exploiting it completely rudely and with a selfishness and a rudeness it's hard to describe. And Mother Nature at a certain moment will somehow reply. What are the lessons from the past? You know, again, while listening to Roxana, I remember the book I've read in India 20 years ago, which completely marked my life. It's a book called Ancient Futures Learning from Ladakh. Maybe you know it, written by Helena Norbert Hodge. She visited Ladakh. She was the first European Westerner who learned Ladakhi language. And in this book, she describes a society which was matriarchal. So maybe the solution will be to go back to matriarchal. Okay, I'm joking a bit. But in this society, all the family members were sharing the care. They were taking care together of the children and of the elderly. It was not only the mother's role to take care of the newborns or of the children. The care was shared with all the family members, and they were living, of course, in extended family. And the woman was freer to do other things than only to do the work. I mean, they were, of course, doing handicrafts, laboring the land, but together with the men, all the men in the family, everything was shared equally. So probably also thinking about the book quoted by Roxana, the Joan Tronto book, coming back to the idea of solidarity. Our societies, modern societies, need to relearn solidarity. The solidarity which is a particularity, more of a particularity of the traditional society than on the modern one. The modern one is very individualistic, more and more individualistic. The richer we become, the more individualistic we are. So maybe we need to go back to our roots and to very far away in our history and to relearn the truth our ancestors were living with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Her Excellency, Madam Ambassador. Thank you for sharing your first-hand experiences of working for women in social distress, need for political will to build gender-inclusive, robust, better, climate-sensitive, and post-COVID world. And you too emphasize the need for solidarity and relearning solidarity. Now, I would ask Professor Lakshmi Linga, can you throw light on feminist vision of building better world in a post-pandemic period in South Asia, what kind of discourses that are happening among the feminists in the South Asian countries. Over to Professor Lakshmi Lingam.
Yeah. So good afternoon, good evening to all the organizers and to my co-panelists, and to all the participants who have joined this conversation. In fact, I'm glad to be part of this webinar because we've been attending several webinars since the lockdown, and very often most of the webinars are broad thematics, requirements linked to issues to do with coping, things to do with negotiating, and also thinking about how do we work with the government to reiterate our prior demands to the state. And when we say something like feminist visioning and feminist envisioning, this is definitely different from those kind of webinars, because here we're actually doing an agenda setting, or let's say we are reclaiming our agenda and recasting it and also re-visibilizing it. It's not that we've never spoken about what Professor Roxana has spoken. I think feminists have all along been speaking about reproduction, procreation, reproduction, and broadly within an umbrella of ecofeminism. Many of these concerns have been always spoken, and therefore bringing it back to an ongoing discourse becomes very important, and I'm glad we are doing that now. And if we were to look around and see what is the kind of building back better, and how do we actually go for a post-COVID world, most of the time we actually hear businesses talking about resilience. And when they talk about resilience, what they're basically talking about is to reimagine the supply value chains, reimagine how employment should not be global, but very much local. They're also looking at how to reinforce sourcing resources more locally than globally, and also moving towards greater digitization and also automation. So the focus therefore is how to have agile businesses and also how to have agile production lines, and within which there is often an emphasis on how to do things where you reduce human labor and use more mechanized labor, and also largely use a lot of artificial intelligence. So basically then, from a business point of view, reconstruction post-pandemic is actually not really visibilizing the kind of questions that we have, and also front-ending workers and workers' welfare, and looking at the human aspects of rebuilding industry and rebuilding the economy. So we do see, therefore, we are definitely not a priority, okay? But during the pandemic, most of you have mentioned, both in terms of experiences and also in terms of statistics, what we have actually seen is when everything has shut down globally, and we have experienced, I think, this after centuries, this basically told us that, nature and health and viruses actually don't really care about geographical nation boundaries. And that this reinforced also that we have a common future, and we need to think about all aspects of our life in tandem, and also taking each other into consideration, the global south and the global north. This also has told us that we need to look at where is the environment in our understanding, and also what do we do about domestic work and care work. However, in terms of rebuilding, again, during the COVID times, we also have seen the most visible aspects were environment and domestic work, or what we call as unpaid care work. These were the most visible. When everything else shut down, these were the most two visible things that we all have very clearly noticed. And work, of course, has moved from the public domain and has come back into the private domain, very much like the pre-industrial scenario where work and home were the same. And that kind of reinforcement happened once again during the COVID times. So the post-COVID where we are in now, trying to build a new normal, what we find is discussions around the environment seem to be happening, though very fractured. And global reports also tell us that the budgets that are being put in recovery, less than 18% is towards greening economy, and much of it still continues to be very polluting. But where we seem to be really missing the bus is bringing back the feminist agenda to visibilize domestic work and to visibilize unpaid care work. And I think that is the key question as to how do we bring this back to the ongoing discourse. While it was visible at the time of the pandemic, and particularly during the lockdown, it doesn't seem to be really now part of anybody's discussion beyond talking about having learned to bake a bit or having learned to take a little bit of work at home, not really taking on, not really moving towards any kind of gender redistribution of domestic work. That really has not happened at all. The culture continues to reinforce its divisions. And, as feminists, we don't seem to be, puncturing that big picture as to how culture reinforces gender division of labor and does not create opportunities for us, or we are not really creating those opportunities that even within a post-pandemic scenario, we still have to bring the gender division of labor back into the center stage. So I would actually say that while, like Professor Roxana has mentioned, while capitalism and market economy have always dictated our everyday lives, I think it's time that we ask for our everyday lives to dictate markets, governments, and everything around us. So how do we put the, how do we turn this around and put the head down and get the economy revolve around, care work or care economy? Or the terms that we've often used is the social reproduction. Okay, and social reproduction is a very encompassing concept that talks about procreation. It talks about social reproduction in terms of reproducing our families, our cultures and communities. And it also talks about reproducing labor, right? So how do we bring back social reproduction to the center so that production and power work for social reproduction rather than reproduction working for production and power? Okay, and therefore I think we have a huge agenda ahead as feminists to bring back this in a big way and bring back our theorizing and bring back our understanding of the fundamental feminist principles of reorganizing the world. And this is our time. And in India, we are actually sitting in our own homes, celebrating the farmers who were protesting for a whole year. And the long protests of farmers actually could reverse 3 major laws that were brought by this government during the pandemic. So that gives us a kind of silver lining that there is room for social movements, and it's our time to bring back ourselves onto the streets and, recover our agenda and put it in front and try to change the discourse and the narratives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lakshmilingam, for mentioning ecofeminism, locally based production, agile production, which the artificial intelligence and machine learning is now taking away human being from the production process, and the reinforcing of gender stereotypes which are imposed by the lockdown culture, deconstruction of new normal, which you have done, is very, very important and insightful. We need to visualize unpaid care, as you said, and let us make the macroeconomy revolve around the care work and social reproduction. And you, I think, ended with an extremely beautiful statement that production and power should work for social production. And I think we feminists have to, and the most important thing, glorious example you gave was for farmer struggle, where 2 women farmers have played a pivotal role. Very, very energizing, and that gives us optimism and hope that another world is possible, better world is possible. Now I would like to ask Professor Dr. Chitra Sinha, that what is the MENA perspective, Middle Eastern and Arab world? What kind of discourses are taking place among feminists for reorganization of the world economy, or building the feminist vision for building better world in the post-pandemic period? Dr. Chitra Sinha, yeah, good.
Thank you, Vibhuti, and I thank my previous speakers for wonderful talk. I learned a lot. But since I have to speak on MENA, it is, I would, though it is known, but still I would like to emphasize that we generally put the, the MENA countries within a single bucket based on regional proximity and religious cultural similarity. However, when it comes to policy decision making, they are very, very, very different. So I would, for the larger audience, I would like to classify the MENA countries in different groups. Like first, there are the resource-rich oil exporting countries that have large native population like Algeria, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. Then there are resource-rich oil exporting, labor importing countries with a large share of foreign expatriate residents constituting even the majority in some case. Like this group of countries are Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC. Bahrain is one of them. Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Libya. Third, there are poor countries like Djibouti, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, Palestinian Authority that import gas and oil. And again, there are countries like Yemen, Syria, Iraq that are torn by war and conflict. So all these set of countries are different kind of experience and policies. So in the poorer countries of MENA region, economic constraints, poor public health system, inadequate social safety nets, and informal employment has placed women in considerable distress, even more considerable distress during the pandemic, with a marked increase in women's unpaid work and loss of jobs. Almost half of employed women in Morocco and Palestinian Authority hold part-time jobs as per ILO report of 2020. And in Egypt, 33% of women's employment is vulnerable. In Palestinian Authority, 1/4 of women are employed in private sector work without any employment contract, so to say. In Jordan, companies started to cut wages, benefits of women employees during pandemic. In Tunisia, most women-led SMEs were closed due to lack of state support. Then a lockdown and curfew measures surely worsened the already high rates of domestic violence across MENA region. Not only due to factors such as mounting concern of job insecurity, cramped living spaces for large families, reduced services, and difficulty to report violence in condition of lockdown, but also due to restrictive social norms that see men as the head of household and responsible for family income. Domestic workers, again, which is predominantly expatriates in this part of the world, their work increased and freedom curtailed due to confinement and excessive sanitization and cleanliness need within the household. Then COVID crisis put women in conflict areas at risk even more. In Libya, where ongoing conflict had already restrained women's economic opportunities, the outbreak of pandemic further increased their vulnerabilities. On the other hand, in oil exporting high income countries of MENA gave protection to their women. I shall here talk about Bahrain, a country of which I'm a resident since 2007. The Bahrain experience show what effective strategy and adequate resource with an already well-established social security system can do to mitigate the pandemic impact of pandemic on women. Bahrain is an oil exporting Gulf country with a per capita income of US $21,000 per year and a population of 1.6 million, majority of which are expatriates. For the citizens, an expansive social safety net exists: free healthcare, free education, free housing, and unemployment allowance being at the center of the policies. Now, during this time, pandemic time, Bahrain took various measures, like for health, the kingdom had taken effective health measures aimed at preserving public health and ensuring social protection in light of the crisis caused by the pandemic. foremost of which was providing free testing to all citizens and residents of the kingdom, even the travelers of Bahrain, as frequently as needed, providing the necessary treatment to all citizens and residents free of charge. The Supreme Council of Women, which is a organization created by the government in support of the government to look after women's issues, and they lead women's concerns many a time. So Supreme Council of Women granted men whose wives were frontline workers the opportunity to work remotely from home, so that at least one parent will be available at home for their children. Work from home policy for employees suffering from respiratory or other chronic diseases, pregnant women, female employees who were entitled to 2-hour childcare leave. In Bahrain, there is, women, those who have children up to certain age, 5 years or 7 years, get 2-3 hours break in between to go home and come back. So, and then later, Bahrain procured vaccination and very early, last December, vaccination started, and free vaccination drive for all. Then again, in fiscal support, payment of salaries to Bahraini working and private sector was financed by unemployment fund, subsidizing of electricity, water bills for individuals and companies, redirecting Tamkeen. Tamkeen is a government agency for financing support. The Tamkeen was advised to help micro and small enterprises, rent exemptions for citizens, increasing infrastructure spending aiming at economic revival. On the financial support during COVID, a variety of financial supports were given by the banks, including installment holiday for borrower a borrower or credit card holder without fees or interest, various restructuring benefits to companies facing loan repayment problem. And above this, the Supreme Council of Women initiated several programs aimed to benefit women, like providing social, legal, economic support, as well as educational support to the children of the frontline families, encouraged work from home, and set alternative plans for the sustainability of the social protection services provided to women. Providing smartphones, tablets, laptop to children of the needy families. School, colleges went on remotely throughout the pandemic period. These measures have been effective, though all these measures were effective in containing the adverse impact of the pandemic on women in Bahrain. However, domestic violence call centers received number of more calls than usual. People in the service industry, along with household help and other house staff, who were mainly expats from Philippines, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, India, both men and women, faced unemployment and other difficulties where if their employers, in most cases, the employers helped, but there were cases where they lost job and they did not get help from their employers. Many of them had to go back home. So though NGOs like Migrant Workers Protection Forum and other NGOs, embassies, ministries, employers extended help and support. So from my part, since I work on Bahrain and Bahraini women's issues, I'm actually right now trying to collect data which are just coming in. Hard data is not yet available. So once it comes, I plan to kind of write a more exhaustive and extensive work on it, and I can share maybe at that point. So this is about MENA in short and Bahrain bit in length.
Thank you, Dr. Chitratsina, for giving such an important perspective on what is happening at the ground level, and also clarifying that all MENA countries cannot be put in same basket. But what we see is pattern is the same of invisibilization of women's care work, increase in domestic violence, women being out of workforce. And I think in the discussion, you can also throw light on what are the current concerns among the feminists in the MENA region. And now I would like to ask Professor Manisha Desai, what are the major highlights of the transnational feminist discourses on feminist vision of building better world in post-pandemic period? And we, to some extent, your previous speakers have also dwelled, like Roxana's speech also covered some of the 4 or 5 feminist discourses. Would you like to supplement or enrich the current discussion on global discourse?
Yeah. First, again, I'd like to thank Professor Dr. Kumar, Professor Patel for organizing this and inviting me, Professor Marinescu, for your, I think, really thought-provoking presentation, which I think in some ways highlights what I was going to talk about in terms of what the transnational perspective on this is. But first, I want to actually start by problematizing the ways in which we talk about a feminist vision. First, and I think this is something that within the transnational feminist community is very much at the center. One is, whose feminism? Which women are we talking about? Because not feminism is a contested term. And even as we pay kind of rhetorical lip service to inclusivity, to intersectionality, when we think about whose feminist visions are being articulated, who is at the table, including at this table, we very often see a few kinds of feminists presented and few kinds of articulations that are centered. So I think one of the first things that is happening within the transnational feminist communities, not just in the context of the pandemic, but I would say for the last 10, 20 years, but particularly in the term, I think in the context of the World Social Forum and the neoliberal globalization, is to kind of break apart this notion of a unified feminist vision, that there are multiple feminist visions. And similarly, I also want to say that we're not in a post-pandemic world. I think the pandemic shifts, and we are actually, way back when Ulrich Beck talked about a continual crisis mode, that we are moving from one crisis to another, and the only way to respond to that is through a paradigmatic shift that Roxana mentioned about. And yet that paradigmatic shift is something that you see from social movements, particularly feminists, but not necessarily all the other actors who equally need to be on board. And while some of the actors, particularly state actors, in the context of pandemic did make, care the center and did pass some kinds of policies, including in the US, which is, the belly of the beast when you talk about neoliberal capitalism, also had big infrastructure commitments that included care work, right? Among the things that the US Biden budget passed was thinking about care work, caregivers, free kindergarten education for all, also providing credits for care workers of different kinds, parents and non-parental caregivers. So in that sense, there's a little bit of a focus even by state actors, but for the most part, I think in some ways it's really a rhetorical and lip service, and then it's business as usual. But I think within the transnational feminist discourses, but also activism, I think there are 3 things that are really important that I want to highlight. One is recognizing that our feminist vision has been rather narrow, that even while we've talked about social reproduction, we've talked about unpaid care labor, the kind of ways in which gender and gender mainstreaming has been co-opted by UN agencies, by state actors, has really in some ways de-radicalized various feminist agendas, and that it's time to kind of re-radicalize and bring that kind of politics to the center stage. And so one example of that, for example, has been to talk about feminism for the 99%, right? So when you think, in the context of both the global North and South, a lot of feminists tend to be educated, English-speaking, upper middle class or middle class feminists who defined a lot of agendas, even though in terms of actual social movements on the ground, you have women, urban, rural, and from all classes and castes who are part of those movements. But in terms of who articulates and defines an agenda, it's been a fairly narrow group of feminists. And so the feminism for the 99%, and one of the ways through which that got translated into activism was the International Women's Strike in 2017, and since then it's been going on in 2018. And it started around reproductive rights, because both in Poland, Argentina, there were a lot of, in some ways, reactions to reproductive rights, particularly abortion. But starting from that, it actually really brought back social reproduction to the center. And so in the last 10 years, for example, bringing wages for housework, bringing in new social reproduction theories have very much become part of the feminism for the 99%, or to kind of, move away from the English domination within feminist writings in transnational feminist circles. I've been also talking about Bahujan feminism rather than subaltern or feminism for the 99%, to make people think that language is important. The moment you have to stop and think, who is Bahujan? Who are the Bahujans? You immediately think of those who are racialized, those whose caste marginalization also becomes evident. And then we begin to see there are lots of different ways to think about it. So that's kind of one of the first things that I think has been going on, is to kind of break open and problematize feminist visions and to kind of rethink about subaltern or feminisms for the 99%. Secondly, there's also been a focus, as I said, on social reproduction, but what kind of social reproduction and how it's tied to issues of climate crisis, which also Roxana mentioned, that when you see, Joan's work, she talks about care, not in terms of just individual care, social and collective care, but also the care for the planet. I just have to sort of mention Vibhuti, whom you mentioned at the end, Roxana, the kind of, post-human sort of articulations, which are also very much part of the transnational feminist, is there again. I think the focus when we think about post-human is on a certain kind of what I would say soft Orientalism, where we somehow think, indigenous people, marginalized communities have in some ways a decolonial vision that is somehow untainted with 500 years of colonial imperial history. And I think that's kind of, the second thing which has become very much part of the subaltern feminisms, particularly Bahujan feminism for 99%, is to think that decolonization isn't an easy binary between indigenous and otherwise marginalized communities and their knowledges versus colonial, post-colonial knowledges. That all of these need to be what Raven O'Connell calls solidarities of epistemologies. That is, no one has any kind of privileged position from which they actually see, or a marginalized position, to talk about standpoint feminism, from which you can somehow articulate a vision that will be all encompassing. And I think what we need instead are to recognize and to bring those marginalized voices, but marginalized voices are not, in some ways free from colonial and post-colonial influences either. And if you live in India, we see that, with Dalit movements, with Bahujan movements, that, and particularly both in politics and non-politics, that those visions themselves are very much now tainted by Hindutva, very much tainted by authoritarianism. So I think, transnational feminists have been wary of this, also this decolonial turn, where we want to, say, we absolutely want to bring in marginalized knowledges, but those still need to be in conversation and in critique, that we cannot just celebrate, without any kind of critical understanding where those knowledges are coming from, because they are not free from the current imperial, authoritarian, in the context of India, Hindutva leanings either. So that's kind of the second point. And the third point, which I think I will stop on, and Lakshmi mentioned that in terms of business and kind of the focus on localizing rather than globalizing. And I think hers was a very critical perspective, in that business now want to localize mostly for profit. But I also want to take us back to the 1970s, when Samir Amin, an Egyptian economist, actually talked about delinking, because he saw global capitalism as not a place for, particularly in those days, what were called third world countries, or today the global south, that could ever be on par with the global north, because the terms had already been set. And in some ways, I think within transnational feminism, there's also, if you think about centering care, care cannot be rendered globally, because when it is, what we see in the context of the global north is that all the care providers are poor women from the global south who are exploited and marginalized. So just centering care isn't enough. What kind of global care change do we have? And if care needs to be localized, which is the only way I think one can give care, then I think we do have to think about local and global and trans-local in very different ways. And then I think we do have to think about delinking. So while we can have global norms and global solidarities or trans-local solidarities, which is what I prefer to talk about in my own work, because I think global doesn't exist anywhere. Global sometimes just becomes, another way to think about the global north. And similarly, transnational often just centers nation states when we already know that there are lots of people who don't have nation states, displaced internal refugees who don't, belong to that. To me, then translocal talks about the ways in which we can build solidarities with people who are struggling and who have a similar vision. And I think that's important. And at the same time, to think that that kind of localization is necessary if we're going to center care. Because while we can have digital care, and we've all, at least those of us who are in the academy, have been teaching remotely, it's not the same kind of education. The students don't like it, we don't like it. So while the digital and can be good for business and for those who can work from home, so large businesses, and I was actually even seeing the report today in Bangalore, but also in New York and big, quote, global cities, there is a problem. Businesses are not going back to the offices because they're recognizing they don't have to pay high rents, in San Francisco and New York and in Bangalore for their offices. And in fact, again, what they're doing is putting the cost of production onto the workers. So I don't know, some corporates give you money for the internet, but my university didn't, pay for my internet. So I'm kind of using, my resources to do the work of the university. So for us, digital work and digital labor does not in some way, cannot, work towards the kind of care-centered economy that we are talking about, because care has to be local. So I think while the businesses want to localize for their own profit agendas, I think as feminists who really want to center care, we also need to think about localizing not just care work, but also the kinds of feminisms that we're talking about. And I think so those are kind of the three things that transnational feminists have been talking about, is to problematize feminist visions, talk about a Bahujan feminism or feminism for the 99%, talk about delocalizing, and talk about the ways in which we can recenter care along with various other kinds of social reproduction, and to kind of also, challenge the gender mainstreaming agenda that everybody now encompasses through the UN, which in some ways de-radicalizes, and in fact kind of delinks the very intersectional analysis that we've developed over the last 20, 30 years. So I think I'll stop there, and so that we have some time for comments, feedback, discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manisha Desai, for bringing in this current discourse on feminism for 99%, a very popular discourse that is going on among the feminists, especially those who are working at a grassroots level. Also, India-specific issue of a Bahujan feminism, and also the importance of problematizing feminism, and also social and collective care. You've also talked about the soft Orientalism, when we try to glorify the past, and also the whole forget the history of 500 years of colonialism, and how can we decolonize? I think delinking from center, it seems to me a utopia, because I see globalization as a fait accompli. What Samir Amin said was very important, but it is a very important political tool that we can have. And also translocal solidarity is that is doable agenda, according to me. I think all four of you have really enhanced the perspective, and also brought in so many nuances. Now the floor is open for Q&A, and can anyone, I have been now thrown out of my desktop, so I'm using my smartphone. So who would like to go ahead? I can't see the chat. Are there any questions? Can you see the chat box? Are there?
No, I don't see any questions in the chat box.
Then I would like to conclude.
There is Professor Patel.
Yeah, there are many veteran feminists, Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, Farah Naqvi. Then I can. There were many more who have been in the women's movement. If they would like to interject or enrich the discussion.
Yeah. Once we have a response from them, there is a question to perhaps Her Excellency on your views on it is by Anjali Verma. She wants to listen more words from you for a woman who lost her entire family in COVID-19. There's a great difference between the two women. One is with her family and the other is without her family. Ma'am, if you could respond to this question. Ambassador.
She's not there, no?
Sorry.
Yes,
No, I'm here.
You are there. Okay.
Yes, so I don't understand the question. I'm sorry.
I think the participant.
I didn't get the question.
Yeah. The participant
if you
can
could,
unmute and speak.
Anjali, if you are there, yes, Anjali, you could ask the question directly.
And also elaborate, yeah.
Yeah. Anjali, you could unmute yourself.
Is she there?
Right. Until Anjali, if you can unmute yourself, till then I am asking.
Got it. Got my link.
I mean, if it's about, how can you answer this question? Losing your entire family during such a tragedy, it's horrible. It's the same like in an armed conflict. I mean, it's the result is the same. I mean, I've met with lone survivors of entire families which have been swept away by conflict. I mean, the pain is, it's horrible. It's tremendous. You lose your mind. And I mean, this pandemic did the same. I mean, it's unspeakable. How can somebody can comment on that? I mean,
yes, certainly. Both are equally unfortunate. And
okay, now I'm back. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
There is a question also, Professor Patel, by Nagarajan Krishnamurthy on women's position and powers and participation differs among countries. Different societies follow different societies follow different kinds of systems and regulations. I don't quite understand which has to be changed. If you could frame this question and.
But it is a comment. It is not question, no? It's only comment. I read it before.
Okay. Yeah, so we could go ahead and for the next round.
Yeah, next round. Okay. So would anyone like to ask question to any of the discussants and or speaker? Professor Roxana. So if there are no questions, then I would like to ask if the speaker and discussant would like to have a final round, say 2 or 3 minutes.
In fact, I just want to ask Professor Roxana, what is the feminist movement in Romania, and what exactly is happening in terms of the kind of questions that we are discussing here?
I would also like to supplement what Professor Lakshmilingam asked, that you are also in touch with the discourses in European Union. So can you throw light on what is happening in the European Union? Because you have 40% of parliamentarians are women in the European Union.
Yes, indeed. Well, feminism in Romania, we can only talk about feminism in Romania post-1990. So I don't know how much where you are of the historic background of Romania and generally Central and Eastern Europe. Excuse me, 1999 was a moment of change for those countries. So after, before 1990, well, we had state-led feminism, if you want. So basically we had quotas, we had representation and everything, but that didn't mean much because we had a dictatorial regime. So although there were women representatives in parliament and government, in fact, the parliament and government didn't do much because we had a dictator who decided everything. So women's representation didn't mean much. In 1990, this has changed, and we had an incipient women's movement, which at the beginning was very much oriented towards Europe. So there, we had a lot, in a way, similar to colonialism, if you want. So a lot of ideas coming from Western feminists that were simply taken over and regurgitated back to Western feminists without really thinking too much about what was going on. And then recently, we actually have a more empowered feminism, if you want, and especially a younger generation of feminists. I can see that happening like every day with my students and with the people around me, graduates of women's issue programs and master's degrees in women's studies. Not very many though, but anyway, so we have a very reduced women's movement, very different from India. This is very reduced. However, we managed to do a lot, although we're just a few. In terms of academic work and also in activism, and mostly related to fighting against gender-based violence. Romania is definitely not doing too well in that respect. Also connected to that, child marriage and very young girls having children. From very young ages, 9, 10 years old and so on. We're on the first place in the European Union on that. I mean, last place if you want, or first place, depending how you look at it. And also for reproductive rights in general, because Romania has a very sad past in terms of reproductive rights. We had a decree which was passed in 1966, which took contraception outside the law, so it became illegal, abortion included, and very many women died and many children were abandoned. And now we can see a lot of attempts by the government to sort of go back to the same idea as we saw in Poland, in Hungary, and in other parts of Europe and the world. So this is also happening in Romania as well. So not, so there is a fight going on, but with very little resources and very few people. In terms of the European Union, yes. We also have a recovery and resilience plan for the post-COVID period, but not much in terms of feminism or gender equality there. The Romanian, I mean, this is for each and every country. So the Romanian one, the Romanian resilience, recovery and resilience plan also includes very limited actions related to gender balance, and most of them have to do with infrastructure. So building infrastructure, which is very important, of course, and it helps women quite a lot, but very few projects in that. Mainly the water and gas network, the gas pipes, and also building some preschools and kindergartens and things like that. In terms of representation, Romania is not doing very well. Political representation, I know that at European level we're around 40, but Romania, for the national parliament, we're at 19% representation of women, and only one woman in this government. We had one woman in the previous government as well. The government has just changed these days, last week, I think. So we're perpetuating this lack of representation. So the situation is not very good.
Yeah, Dr. Chitra Sinha, would you like to say?
Yes, like as I said, that the diversity is pretty much, and since now I'm working on Bahrain, I would like to stick to that. In Bahrain, the women's issues are led by the Supreme Council of Women, and they are reaching out to the world for suggestion. They are meeting countries, those who are doing well, and taking the good things that they can do and trying to implement. They are in touch with United Nations, so on and so forth. But there are a lot of NGOs which work for work towards women's violence, domestic violence, any complaint at work, and all offices also, they have their women's grievances cell. So those things are kind of well discussed, and it goes on, as Professor Roxana was saying, that it is still government led here. So, but then few things which we were discussing the other day, that the rhetoric which encourages women to participate in the labor market by working from home in order to attain work-life balance and so on is problematic, as women are assigned the sole responsibility for care within the family. So, I mean, the government here, we feel that have a responsibility to counter such traditional perception of gender role using gender transformative policies, and allowing only working mothers but not fathers to work from home. Then it kind of it makes it very obvious that mothers can be spared from work and be at home and do both the work paid and unpaid work. And it also, like, in some way favors single women and childless women in a way. So Bahrain did that with the husband of frontline workers, like they were allowed to be at home, but that can be from now made a norm. And instead, like, since I'm still in touch with Swedish University and worked for 6 years there. I mean, it will take time, but it should start from now to kind of have a policy which is more transformative. And secondly, this Arab state play a key role in global care chain, hosting the largest number of migrant domestic workers in the world, like 3.16 million in 2015, according to ILO, and the majority of whom are women. So labor standards ensuring decent work for domestic workers are often absent. Currently, due to COVID-19 outbreak, migrant workers are particularly vulnerable to additional work, restrictions of freedom of movement, violence and exploitative conditions. Their weekly off is not given in many cases. The specific condition and realities of these workers now must be taken into consideration and appropriately addressed. And finally, in our global world, the pandemic has often resulted in a narrow policy of choice of citizens first in many cases here. So citizens of countries are protected through fiscal, financial, and safety nets, while migrants often fall through the cracks. So in a world where the labor movement is increasingly global, and migrant laborers are often, and their families often suffer by missing out of benefits and supportive policies from home and from their host country. So I feel that policy choices in a global world must be more inclusive. So I think these 1 or 2 points I would.
Yeah. Okay. So now, Dr. Lakshmi Lingam, do you want to have last word, or can I go conclude the session?
I think you should conclude, because
okay,
there's no way of putting anything about India in 1 minute. So.
Yeah, I know. Okay. So I think in conclusion, what has emerged in this discussion is that at one level, what is current situation is rife with unpaid and unvalued care work, self-deprivation, domestic violence, digital divide, deplorable condition of the migrant workers, massive unemployment, women farm workers and women in the sector being neglected, informal workers facing massive hardship, and also economization of care is a major challenge. Climate crisis is also like hovering around us on a Damocles sword. As against that, the feminist vision talks about people before profit, invest in care, invest in education, data collection, visibility of women in statistics and indicators, strengthening of people's solidarity through union or voluntary organizations, civil society organizations, and critiquing the future of work, which is informed by artificial intelligence and machine learning, importance of women's leadership in the political arena, loan restructuring at a macro policy level, and gender mainstreaming, and income support to the people who are facing semi-starvation and unemployment. So I would like to quote here the Executive Director of UN Women, who rightly said, and I quote, "Disaster shapes the course of history. As the world seeks how best to recover from coronavirus pandemic and build resilience, we call on all countries to make long overdue investment in care economy. That means prioritizing budget allocations to expand access and improve quality of care service, ensure decent work and social protection. Such investment will be critical for sustainable recovery that yields multiple returns. Women with care responsibility who have lost their jobs will be more easily re-enter the workforce. Resource will be directed to care economy with potential to create jobs at the time when unemployment rates are soaring and governments are keen to get the people back to work. And we will be supporting green jobs that provide care for people while avoiding further environmental degradation and keeping the gender justice and climate justice as a firm priority. Global policies impact local economies. Gender Equality Forum is a positive move in the direction of gender equality and confirming accountability for its gender commitments that speedily entrusted to grassroots, local women's rights groups, community-based civil society organizations. They are addressing issues arising out of intersectional marginalities and problems of women in all their diversity that include urban poor, farmers, caste and ethnicity-based exclusion and discrimination, informal settlements, rural and maritime areas, sex workers, LGBTQIA communities, non-binary people, people living with disabilities, internally displaced persons due to mega development project and due to natural or man-made disaster from across the region. So I think it is in this context that it is very important that all the tripartite bodies, whether they are of state, nation states, the UN system and the international NGOs and the communities, that this kind of a dialogue is need of an hour. And I would like to also respond to inform you that there is a very positive and encouraging response we have received from stalwarts like Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, who has said that she has found that today's discussion very truly insightful and enriching, and the nuance, so that the very comprehensive. And the Farah Naqvi also, and who writes on global and national issues, she also has admired today's discussion, and she said that it will have a snowballing effect and more such discussions will take place, because currently we are only addressing, responding to the emergency, but there is a need for a far-sighted vision. And without dreams, we can't even strive to attain those dreams. So it is very important. And I congratulate Dr. Roxana for such a bold attempt that she has made for thinking about envisioning the feminist future. And all four esteemed discussions, Ambassador Madam, Professor Lakshmi Lingam, Professor Manisha Desai, and Dr. Chitra Sinha. And now over to IMPRI team, Dr. Simi Mehta.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Vibhuti, for your wonderful conclusion for this wonderful program, and the topic that we had today on feminist vision of building a better world in the post-pandemic period. This has been truly enlightening. And as you have really mentioned about the enriching insights that have gone through in this entire evening today has been a great learning experience for all of us. I would like to formally conclude with the vote of thanks on behalf of the IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center. I would like to extend our gratitude to our speaker, Professor Roxana Marinescu, for sparing her time and for this brilliant presentation that you have made, ma'am, today. And I would also like to thank all our esteemed discussants, Her Excellency Ambassador Daniela, for joining the conversation and sharing her experiences. I'm equally delighted and grateful to Professor Manisha Desai, to Dr. Chitra Sinha and Professor Lakshmi Lingam, and most of all to our Professor Vibhuti Patel for leading the discussion so wonderfully and building so many food for thought that really this needs to be a continued process of discussion. Thank you so much to everyone who attended this session here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live, and also to all those who would be watching the session later on YouTube and listening to our podcast. Thank you very much and good evening to everyone. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.